to me, when you trust artists, artists do amazing things when given the opportunity to talk about what's meaningful to them and what quickens their pulse. My name is Nancy Baker Cahill. I am a new media artist who examines power, selfhood, and embodied consciousness through drawing and shared immersive space. I have a studio practice. I would say, in some ways, a traditional studio artist, and I also have a new media practice, the Fourth Wall app, which is a platform I created for creative inclusion and resistance. Drawing has always been my first language. However, I've always had a foot in video as well. One of them is much more expensive than the other, so I've usually adverted more to traditional drawing on paper and trying to push drawing as far as I can, sculpturally, digitally, in other ways. One of the most sort of fascinating outgrowths of collapsing my drawing and video practices into digital drawing is that they've become completely interdependent. What I've noticed once I started drawing in VR and drawing in 360 is that, and really using my entire body in the drawing process, as much as I do on paper, it tends to be, one-sided. It's my body against paper, making marks, trying to sort of extract forms from this perceived void or imagined void. Of course, in VR, you're actually constructing, it's actually quite sculptural and architectural in nature in that 360 space, in infinite space. You're actually embodied in infinite space. The way that I now represent forms, mass, velocity, all of it on paper has changed dramatically. It feels much more sculptural and, in many cases, unbeknownst to me, appears to kind of penetrate into the space off the paper. The reason I initially got into AR, it sprang out of actually a desire to increase access at the time to my VR drawings. Once I started working in AR, I realized, wow, there's so much more to it than just accessibility. It occupies this fascinating conceptual space, this fascinating psychological space. It really exists in between. It's sort of there and not there. And you need this visual prosthesis to experience it. So it has an enormous subversive potential, but it also has an incredible sort of dreamlike potential and memory potential and storytelling potential. VR is such a deeply, deeply, extraordinarily immersive experience. It's really a whole entire contained world that's set out before you. And what AR allows for is for this layering over the world as we experience it, whatever you want to call it, AFK, IRL, the quote real world, and allows us to really add and augment content and ideas and activate ideas around specific sites, specific objects, movements, histories, and futures. Liberty Bell was a really extraordinary opportunity where I was invited by the Art Production Fund to create a bespoke piece at the time for Philadelphia. And when I started thinking about Philadelphia and my own experience with Philadelphia, I remembered vividly a childhood trip to see the Liberty Bell, which is, I think everyone knows if there's one thing they remember about the Liberty Bell, it's that it's cracked. And I started to think about the very cracked and broken notion of liberty and really ask the question, what does liberty even mean under these circumstances, and liberty for whom? We've got centuries of radical inequality, economic inequality, worse and worse, racial inequality, structural racism, disinformation, which is all new, voter suppression, environmental racism and climate change, police brutality. We have this ugly legacy of our immigrant detention centers and unchecked nationalism and armed militias and biased algorithms. I mean, the list goes on. And so what does liberty mean against the backdrop of all of these challenges that we face collectively? I really wanted to think about Civil War and how we as a country have become so divided and so kind of cleft in two. So that was the springboard for the actual drawing itself, which is sort of a bell cut in half, a very abstracted bell made up of these threads, these red, white, and blue threads that are kind of at war with themselves. I mean, they ultimately cohere and they're entirely interdependent, but they're struggling and straining against each other. And the soundscape that we created to accompany this, I had the great fortune of collaborating with Ana Luisa Petrisco, who's an amazing artist. We wanted the soundscape to mirror both the animation of the piece, but also this kind of idea of being lulled by a bell, lulled into a sense of complacency. It's sort of, we all know what this means, and then have it become increasingly dissonant and arrhythmic. When you start to pick it apart and start to really examine what liberty means as a concept, there's sort of this inevitability. So really it was intended as an invitation to conversation around what that means. Where curation is concerned, the most important thing to me as the artistic director and founder of the app is, are these rigorous conversations? Are these conversations that are urgent? Are they important to the artists, and why? My main metric is rigor and vision of the artist, and a kind of demonstrated commitment to whatever issue is most important to them. Because to me, when you trust artists, artists do amazing things when given the opportunity to talk about what's meaningful to them and what quickens their pulse. It just becomes this extraordinary conversation, not just with the fellow artist, about what they want to do and how they want to activate the ideas they want to activate and using AR, whether they're using it strictly as a tool, or whether they're using it conceptually or for whatever reason. But also, in addition to that, the levels of collaboration that it requires. If it's important to an artist to geolocate a work across the world, and neither of us can be there, the people we end up collaborating with on the ground to adjust, scale, height, location, whatever, that itself is this ephemeral moment of connection, ephemeral moment of collaboration toward a shared goal. And that is one of the most beautiful and unexpected results of working in this medium. In the very first version, my team at Drive Studios and I photogrammetried the interior of my studio. I really wanted to invite that kind of intimate engagement with an artist's creative space, and to also kind of demythologize it. Accessibility, again, being of primary concern, we developed a teleport function within the architecture, within that space, within the photogrammetried space, so that if you were in any way, compromised in terms of your mobility, you would have no problem getting around you just by tapping the screen. Wouldn't it be an extraordinary thing if we could just, walk or teleport or however we want to move through space, fly into other spaces within spaces, and the portals of AR allow that to happen. There's a wonderful architect, Juhani Pallasmaa, and he wrote many books. One of them was The Thinking Hand, which is such a beautiful title. And the other book that has been really, really formative for me is called The Eyes of the Skin. And in it, he kind of rails against the hegemony of the visual and exhorts other architects to consider the, haptics, sound, all the other senses in creating space and in building space, immersive space. And so I think about that all the time. How does your body engage with the artwork? How does your body engage with something particulate? How does it engage? What does it feel like to move through a digital drawing? All of these questions are important, and they need to be taken into consideration when you're in the business of constructing these experiences. Not to control the user's experience, but to enhance it to such a degree that if they're led by their own curiosity, they could have any number of kind of transformative experiences. Climate change is very much top of mind. Increasingly, the fire season here was so devastating. What I am interested in doing, at least through Last Dance, is to invite a consideration of the fragility and ephemerality of life itself and of the planet. And I often think that, abstraction is this wonderful middle ground where a broad group of people can write themselves into it and can identify with it somehow. So I created a very, very abstract figure, kind of in a triumphant pose, who ultimately dissolves and disintegrates, as we all do, as we all will, but more as a kind of poetics around considering time, temporality, the earth itself, life itself, not to be grandiose in any extent, but, we have so little time to make an impact. And if we don't, of course, that time frame shrinks even more rapidly.